Hello, it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Thrifter. Today I'm going to be talking about Pet Sematary by Stephen King. I figured in this video I would talk about the book, the film adaptation which came out in 1989, the documentary about the making of, and also the upcoming remake. So this video is going to be all Pet Sematary all the time. The book was originally published in 1983, and there will be some spoilers for the book and the film in this video, so if you don't want any spoilers at all, then I will say goodbye to you now. But if you don't mind spoilers, or if you've already read the book, or you at least have some familiarity with the storyline, then feel free to keep watching. I read the book as a buddy read with Carol at Carol Marie Reads. I will leave her channel linked down below, go check her out. She is also a horror fan, amongst other things. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I thought it was brilliant. I gave it 5 stars. This particular edition is just over 400 pages long, and I got through it much quicker than I thought I would. I really liked the setup in this book. I thought getting to know the characters and their backstories was really well written. I really enjoyed all of that. So it does start off at a bit of a slower pace, but it was never boring for me, at least. I was very interested in the characters and getting to know them better. And then the story builds and builds into this incredibly tense and atmospheric. About the final quarter is just something that you're not going to want to put down. It has tension and atmosphere. It has some really creepy scenes, and it also has this very emotional aspect in the story. This story is about the Creed family, Lewis and his wife Rachel, and their 2 young children, Ellie and Gage. They move to a small town where Lewis is taking up the position of a doctor at the local university. And so they're moving into this much smaller town than what they're used to. They're getting used to the new area, the new neighbours, and this particularly busy road that is right outside the front of their house. The Creeds soon meet their neighbours, an older couple called Judd and Norma, and Judd and Lewis form a very quick friendship, almost like a father-son relationship. And they spend a lot of their evenings together on Judd's porch, having a few beers at the end of a day. The Creeds also soon learn that behind their house is a pet cemetery, which is where the local kids over the years have buried their pets, many of which have died after being knocked down on this very busy road. The visit to the pet cemetery becomes Ellie, the young daughter's, first introduction to death, and she's really upset about it. She has a cat called Church. She really loves this cat, and she's beginning to realise that one day Church is going to die, and she doesn't want Church to die. She thinks that's unfair, and she doesn't want to be without Church. So this is bringing up a lot of new feelings for her, and Lewis tries to talk it through with her and explain that death is natural, but Ellie's mum Rachel is really unhappy that Ellie has been introduced to this conversation at all. Rachel thinks death is unnatural, she doesn't want to talk about it, and she doesn't want the conversation with Ellie to go any further. She wishes it had never been brought up. We learn more about Rachel and her history with death. She had an older sister called Zelda who had spinal meningitis, and she was confined to a bed for a very long time, and Rachel and her parents grew to hate Zelda. She became a burden. She was their dirty little secret in the back bedroom of their house. And one day Rachel's parents had left her alone with Zelda, and Zelda died, and Rachel never really came to terms with this. This event really traumatised her as a child, and she's had a very complicated relationship with death ever since then. It's something that she hasn't really talked about, but after the conversation of death comes up with Ellie, she finally breaks down and tells Lewis about what happened. I thought this was really well done in the book, and it really does depict how things like this can affect us for such a long time, you know, potentially for the rest of our lives. So sometime later, Church unfortunately becomes victim to the road, and Lewis finds him one day while his wife and kids are back visiting Rachel's parents in Chicago, and Lewis doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to have to break this heartbreaking news to his daughter, especially while she's away from home. So Judd decides he's going to try and make this situation right. He doesn't want Ellie to have to deal with death firsthand at this point either, and he suggests they take the cat and bury it. So Judd and Lewis set off for what Lewis assumes is the Pet Sematary, but once they get there, Judd continues. He starts climbing over this huge barrier of dead trees, and Lewis knows he shouldn't follow, but he does. And they carry on this long and terrifying walk, and they finally arrive at an ancient Native American burying ground. And Judd knows that this burying ground has special powers, and it can bring things back from the dead. So Church the cat returns, and Lewis can't quite believe it. He just assumes that he must have still been alive when he buried it, but in fact Church has come back from the dead, and he's definitely a different cat. He is not happy. So when Rachel and the kids get back from Chicago, Ellie immediately notices the difference in Church and that he smells bad. An element of this story is about the Wendigo, which is a part of Native American folklore, and it is this entity that seems to have some control over the people of the town in continuing this cycle of bringing bodies to the burying ground, and it feels like this entity is feeding off their grief and making this cycle continue. The story goes on, we learn more about the family, we learn more about Judd and Norma and other characters in the book, and more about the Pet Sematary and the burying ground. I thought all of this was fantastic and really well written. It was interesting. There was never any moment that I was bored. And one fateful day, Gage is knocked down by a truck on this very busy road and dies. And obviously the family are in shock. They're dealing with the loss of their young son, they're grieving, and it's just a horrific situation to be in. I thought the way that this story described death and grief, losing a loved one, was very well done, and it also detailed that we do deal with this in different ways. The way that I deal with it might be different to how you deal with it, and there isn't one way that you should or do deal with grief. And grief is something that can stay with you for a very long time, and I have lost family members and other loved ones, and yeah, I'm not gonna carry on with that because apparently I can't handle it, but yeah, it's horrible. So I thought this was handled really well in this book. Lewis is distraught after losing his son, and even though he knows what happened with Church, he is still considering digging Gage up and taking him to the burying ground. He is struggling with this. He's struggling with the emotions of losing his son. He feels like he's going insane in having these thoughts about digging his dead son up and reburying him. He knows he shouldn't go ahead with this, but part of him just wants his son back so much that he would do anything to have him back. Also, it is implied that this entity also has something to do with controlling the outcome of this scenario and controlling what Lewis is doing and bringing this body to the burying ground. And the question about this entity goes so far as not only did it possibly cause Lewis to bury his son there in the burying ground, but did it possibly cause Gage's death in the first place? this entity is preventing Rachel from coming home from Chicago when she realises something is wrong and she needs to get back to Lewis. This entity makes Judd fall asleep. Judd is desperate to stay awake and wait until Lewis gets home with Gage because he knows that's what's going to happen, but he falls asleep and then it's too late. So this entity is really all-seeing and has its claws into this town. So I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was really well written, the characters were fantastic, the atmosphere and the tension in here was so well done, and the emotional aspect was really realistic and detailed. And this last 100 pages or so was just so gripping. Even though I kind of knew what was happening, I just had this horrible feeling of nervousness and dread in the pit of my stomach for the whole time, and you're just waiting for this climax. And I thought the ending was chilling and emotional, and yeah, it was definitely a satisfying ending. So yes, I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. I highly recommend it whether you are a big Stephen King fan or not. If you are into horror, then this is one you definitely should check out. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the film adaptation, which came out in 1989 and was directed by Mary Lambert. I first watched Pet Sematary many moons ago when I was a young teenager, and I remember I watched it at a sleepover with a bunch of my friends, and the most terrifying thing that I remember was Zelda. I had that image of Zelda ingrained in my mind to this day, and I remember whenever she came on screen, me and my friends were all just screaming, and that's one of the things that I distinctly remember from the film. I only have vague recollections of the rest of it. I knew the basic storyline, I could remember Fred Gwynne as Judd, and I remember Miko Hughes as Gage, but other than that, the details were very hazy for me. So after reading the book, I really wanted to rewatch the film because it's been a long time, and I watched it just recently and I still enjoyed it somewhat. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars overall. I thought one of the biggest strengths of the film was the look of it. I thought all of the locations were fantastic, the sets, all of the set design, the art department, the special effects and makeup were all really well done. They were fantastic. I think unfortunately what let it down is the storytelling itself. I know that adapting a book to the screen is bound to come with some compromises. Things have to be changed or cut out, but I feel in this instance the things that were cut out just ended up making parts of the story a bit confusing and not really making as much sense as it should. So for one example, in the book, when Judd tells Lewis about how he buried his dog Spot in the burying ground, even though Judd also had experience with other people bringing back animals that did have a mean streak, he knew that it was possible that if they buried Church, the cat, it would come back okay, not the same, but it would still be a cat and Ellie wouldn't have to go through dealing with its death. It wasn't a definite that it would come back with a mean streak. But in the film, when Judd tells this story, his dog Spot comes back aggressive, and that then doesn't make sense as to why Judd would advise Lewis to bury the cat in the burying ground if he knows that it's likely it's going to come back evil. We also don't get the same level of character development as we do in the book, which is understandable, but it does impact the film in, I think, a bad way, because some people's motivations just aren't very clear, they're a bit confusing. We don't see this conflict that Lewis is having over what to do about his dead son. You know, we don't get into that really emotional tug of war on what is he going to do. You know, can he dig his dead son up and take him to the burying ground? Like, is he desperate enough in his grief to do that? And that just, I don't think, comes across nearly as well in the film. It's kind of rushed and we just don't get the same impact. And also I don't think the Wendigo element of the story comes across. I don't think it's obvious that when Rachel is trying to travel home at the end of the film that she is somehow being prevented from getting there by this entity. And I just don't think it's very clear that this entity has a hold on the town and is causing some of these things to happen, or at least having some kind of impact in these things happening. And Stephen King actually wrote the screenplay for this adaptation, so it's a shame that the storytelling aspect just didn't come across in the same way. It just felt a bit muddled and things were not as clear or as understandable as they are in the book. I think one of the standout parts of the film was still Zelda. She was still terrifying and really had an impact. It's definitely one of the creepiest parts of the film. And again, it doesn't quite get the same emotional impact as to what Rachel is going through as a kid, but it's still creepy. So yeah, there are definitely some good and not so good elements to the film, but I know it is one that a lot of people love. I still enjoyed it somewhat and I would still recommend watching it because the good parts are really very good, but the storytelling aspect I think lets it down a little bit. I also watched a documentary about the film called Unearthed and Untold: The Path to Pet Sematary, directed by John Campopiano and Justin White, and this came out in 2017. And this was really good. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was fascinating to see all of this behind the scenes stuff. There were loads of interviews with cast and crew, loads of behind the scenes footage and photographs. The detail in this film was very well done. They obviously put a lot of effort into this and tracking down the people that worked on it. We also had interviews with loads of people that were local extras and, you know, small parts that were local to the area that it was being filmed in. Stephen King basically had a clause for this film that said it had to be shot in Maine, so that was really interesting, and just seeing how the locals reacted to that and how all of the filming went. It was just really enjoyable to hear more about everyone's involvement in the film and learning a bit more about everything behind the scenes, like how certain sets were made and makeup was done. Yeah, I just find all of that stuff really interesting, and I think it was really well done in this documentary. If you're a fan of the film Pet Sematary, then definitely check this documentary out. Even if you're not a huge fan, it's still a very well done documentary, really interesting, and I ended up giving this 4 stars out of 5. And I also wanted to talk about the upcoming remake, which is due to be released next year in 2019. Now, I'm not always a fan of remakes. There are some very good ones, but there are also some terrible ones that you just think, why did you even have to do that? But I am really looking forward to this one because my friends Dennis and Kevin are directing it. I am so excited for them to be working on this, and I can't wait to see what they come up with. They wrote and directed a film called Starry Eyes, which came out in 2014, which is a fantastic horror film. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. And I actually saw the film before meeting them, so that is not a biased opinion. It is genuinely a brilliant horror film. It's about an aspiring actress in Hollywood. She is working a crappy day job and just waiting for her big break. And it follows her and how far she will go in order to reach the fame and success that she wants. So I know that the Pet Sematary remake is in really good hands, and they are currently filming and it is due to come out next year. So yeah, I'm just super excited for this one. I think it's going to be amazing. So those were all my thoughts on everything Pet Sematary. Let me know if you've read the book, seen the film, anything else that you want to talk about regarding it. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!